The day Vivian took everything, she wore a red blouse. I noticed that first. The color of luck, of celebration, of New Year's envelopes pressed into children's palms. She had chosen it deliberately, I think, the way a person chooses armor before walking into battle. She stood behind the counter of my shop, my counter, the one my husband Min and I had sanded smooth with our own hands in the spring of 1984, and she smiled at the small crowd gathered near the door like she had built every inch of it herself. The morning smelled like detergent and something floral, gardenias maybe, from the arrangement someone had placed near the register, new flowers. I had never kept flowers in the shop. Flowers wilted in the steam. "The shop doesn't need you anymore," Vivian said. She was not looking at me when she said it. She was looking at Mrs. Pauline Nguyen, at the two young women Vivian had hired to replace my staff, at Howard Lamb standing near the side wall with his hands folded in front of him like a man at a funeral. "You can barely lift a basket. Let the younger ones handle it now." The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when something ugly has been said in a pleasant voice. I looked at her hands. The nails were painted the same red as her blouse. Not a callus on them. Not a single mark from the wringing and folding and sorting that leaves its signature on the palms of women who actually work. I had been wringing and folding and sorting since before Vivian was born. My hands looked like a map of somewhere difficult. I smiled. Not the smile people give when they agree, or when they are embarrassed, or when they want to smooth a moment over with politeness. I smiled the way I smile when I already know the end of a story, and I am simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Vivian blinked. She had expected tears, I think. Or anger. Some visible crumbling that would confirm what she had already decided about me, that I was old and confused and grateful for whatever crumbs the younger generation chose to leave behind. She had not expected stillness. It unsettled her. I could see it in the way her smile flickered at the edges, just for a moment, before she turned back to Howard Lamb and said something about the new pricing structure. I said nothing. Mrs. Pauline Nguyen caught my eye from across the room. She was 71 years old and had known me for 30 years. She taught elementary school for 4 decades, and she understood silence the way only teachers do as a language with its own grammar. She gave me the smallest nod. I gave her nothing back. Not yet. I turned and walked out of my own shop. The street outside was bright and already warm, the kind of morning in late March that tricks you into thinking the heat will be gentle this year. I walked slowly. I have walked slowly since the surgery, since the 3 weeks in the hospital, when the kidney stone they had dismissed as muscle pain turned out to be something that required 2 procedures and a great deal of patience. My son Thomas had visited twice. Vivian had not visited at all. She had sent a basket of fruit with a card that said, in her looping handwriting, "Rest well, Mother, we are taking good care of things." I had eaten the fruit. I had kept the card. I sat down on the low concrete step outside the dry goods store 2 doors down. The owner, an older man named Mr. Bin, appeared in the doorway and looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has witnessed something and does not know what to do with what he saw. "Margaret," he said. "I'm fine," I told him. He brought me tea anyway. It came in a small glass, the way tea always comes when someone is not sure what else to offer. I held it in both hands and looked down the street at the sign above my shop. The sign was new. Vivian had changed it sometime in the past 3 weeks. The old sign, hand-painted letters on a wooden board. The paint slightly chipped at the V in our family name, was gone. In its place hung a printed banner in white and gold, clean and modern and completely unfamiliar. 40 years. I had opened that shop in the year my son Thomas started primary school, which meant I had been folding other people's clothes since before he knew how to tie his own shoes. My husband Min drove me to the licensing office on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1984. And I sat across from a bored government clerk and answered every question in my careful, deliberate way, and I walked out with a piece of paper that had my name on it. Margaret Tran, owner. I had pressed that paper flat with my palm before sliding it into the envelope I kept in the tin box beneath the altar. The same tin box that had sat under Min's altar for the past 11 years, since the morning I found him still in his chair with his reading glasses on and his tea gone cold beside him. The box was gray with age and had a small dent in the left corner where Thomas had dropped it once as a boy. Inside, The original lease agreement, signed by the old landlord Mr. Cao in his cramped handwriting, the business license, a photograph of Min and me standing in front of the shop on the first day, both of us squinting against the sun, both of us smiling like people who do not yet know how hard the work will be and have decided they do not care. The tin box was still there, under the altar, in my bedroom, in my house. Vivian had never once asked me where I kept important documents. She had assumed, I suppose, the way people who underestimate you always assume, that someone like me would not think to protect anything, that I was the kind of old woman who kept her papers loose in a drawer somewhere, or trusted her son to handle things, or simply forgot. I drank my tea. In the old stories my mother used to tell, back in the village where she grew up, there was a saying about still water, about how the surface that shows you nothing is the surface you should fear the most. She said it to me once when I was 12 years old and furious about something I can no longer remember, and she tapped my hand and said, "Still water runs deepest, Margaret. Remember that." I had remembered it for 60 years. I set down the glass. I thanked Mr. Bin. I stood up carefully, the way I stand up now, with one hand on my knee and a breath held in reserve. Then I walked home, past the new sign above my old shop, past the red blouse visible through the window, past all of it. I had a tin box to open. Min used to say the shop smelled like clouds. He meant the steam, of course, the great rolling waves of it that rose from the pressing machines every morning and turned the front windows white by 8 o'clock. But he said it like a compliment, the way he said most things, with that particular gentleness that made ordinary observations sound like small poems. He would come by on his lunch break from the hardware store 3 blocks away and stand in the doorway with his motorcycle helmet tucked under his arm, and he would breathe in deeply and say, "Still smells like clouds in here, Margaret," and I would wave him away from the clean shirts because he always arrived dusty. That was the rhythm of our life for a long time. The shop opened at 7 and closed at 6. Monday through Saturday. I took Sunday mornings for the market and Sunday afternoons for nothing in particular, which Min said was the most important appointment of the week. He was right about that. He was right about most things, though I did not always tell him so while he was alive. That is the particular cruelty of grief, it teaches you. Too late, all the things you should have said out loud. I have told him since. I tell him now, on the evenings when I light the incense at his altar and stand in the blue-gray smoke and say whatever needs saying. The altar sits against the north wall of our bedroom, beneath the window that looks out at the neighbor's jackfruit tree. There is a photograph of Min at 53, the age when his hair had gone fully silver and he had finally grown into his face, and a small ceramic cup. I fill with tea every morning because he always drank his tea before anything else. There are dried chrysanthemums that I replace when they begin to look tired. There is the tin box. I put the tin box there after he died because I could not think of a safer place. The altar is the one corner of the house that no one touches carelessly. Even Thomas, even as a grown man, even with all his modern looseness about such things, slows when he passes it. Something in us knows to be careful around the places where we keep our dead. We opened the shop the year Thomas turned 6. I remember because he insisted on coming to the signing at Mr. Cao's office, and he sat in the chair beside me in his school uniform with his hands folded in his lap, very serious, watching me write my name on the lease agreement. Afterward, he asked me what I had signed and I said, "Our future." And he thought about that for a moment and then asked if we could stop for ice cream on the way home. We stopped for ice cream. Min bought 3 portions and ate his on the sidewalk in the sun like a man who had just been told very good news. Mr. Cao was a fair landlord. He was 60 years old when we signed, and he ran the building the way a person runs something they intend to keep in good condition. He fixed the pipes when they needed fixing. He repainted the exterior every few years without being asked. When Min died, Mr. Cao came to the funeral and stood near the back and said nothing except, at the end, that he was sorry and that the rent could wait until the following month. I did not need the extra month, but I thanked him as if I did, because some offers are made out of decency, and decency should be acknowledged. Mr. Cao sold the building 3 years ago. His son had moved to Canada, and he was tired of the stairs. The new owner was Howard Lamb. I did not know Howard Lamb well when he bought the building. I knew him the way you know a face in a neighborhood by sight, by context, by the small accumulation of impressions that add up to a general sense of a person. He drove a car that was too clean. He wore a watch that caught the light in the way of things designed to be noticed. When he came to introduce himself after the purchase, he stood in the middle of my shop and looked around with the expression of someone calculating rather than observing, and he said the space had good bones, as though he had not yet decided what to do with it. I offered him tea. He declined. I noted that. Min would have known what to make of Howard Lamb immediately. He had a quality I have always lacked: the ability to read a person in the first 30 seconds and file them accurately. I tend to watch and wait, to collect evidence slowly over time until I am certain. Min used to say it was because I was a scientist at heart, that I would not form a conclusion until I had gathered enough data. I told him that was a generous interpretation of stubbornness, but stubbornness had served us well enough. The shop survived 3 recessions, a flood that took out the electrical system for 2 weeks, the year the washing machines all needed replacing at the same time, and the long difficult period after Min died when I ran everything alone because Thomas was 24 and living in Saigon, and I could not bring myself to ask him to come home. I hired a woman named Mrs. Han to help with the heavy lifting, and I kept the doors open, and I got up every morning at 5:30, and I kept going. You keep going. That is not a philosophy. It is simply what you do when there is no acceptable alternative. Thomas came back eventually. He came back with Vivian, who he had met at a company dinner, and married 8 months later in a ceremony that was beautiful and efficient, and somehow managed to feel, even on the day itself, like it had been organized primarily for photographs. I stood in my ao dai and smiled at the camera and held my flowers and thought, she is very capable. She is very capable, and she does not listen when other people are speaking. She waits for them to finish. I thought I was simply being a difficult mother-in-law. I thought I should try harder. In the years after the wedding, Vivian came to the shop occasionally. She would arrive in the early afternoon when it was quietest and walk through the back rooms with her eyes moving over everything in that calculating way, the same way Howard Lamb had looked at the space. And she would ask questions that sounded like interest but felt like inventory. How many machines? What the monthly revenue looked like? Whether the lease was up for renewal soon? I answered carefully. I told her what was true without telling her everything that was true. That is a different thing. I did not know then what I know now. I did not know that she had already met Howard Lamb, that they had already had the first of what I would later learn were several private conversations. I did not know that the questions were not curiosity, but something in me had already begun to keep the tin box a little closer. I cannot explain it better than that. Call it instinct. Call it 40 years of reading people across a counter, of knowing before someone speaks whether they have come in good faith or otherwise. The water was still. But underneath, I was already moving. The kidney stone announced itself on a Tuesday. I was at the shop, lifting a basket of folded linens from the sorting table, when the pain came, not gradually, the way most pain introduces itself, but all at once, like a door being slammed open from the inside. I sat down on the floor. Mrs. Han found me there a few minutes later and called Thomas. And Thomas called Vivian, and by the time the ambulance arrived, there were 3 people standing over me with the particular expression of people who are concerned but also calculating what this inconvenience will cost them. I noticed that, even then, even on the floor with a pain in my side that made breathing a negotiation. The hospital was loud and fluorescent, and smelled like antiseptic and boiled rice from somewhere far down the corridor. They ran tests for 2 days before they understood what was happening. Then they explained it to me in the careful way doctors explain things to women of a certain age, slowly and with many pauses, as though the age itself might have affected the hearing. I told the young doctor that I had run a business for 40 years, and could follow a medical explanation without visual aids. He had the grace to look briefly embarrassed, and then spoke to me like a person. 2 procedures, 3 weeks, possibly more, depending on how I responded. Thomas came to the hospital that evening. He sat in the chair beside my bed, and held my hand, and looked genuinely worried, which I appreciated. He has always been, at his core, a gentle person. The difficulty with gentle people is that their gentleness can be redirected by someone who knows how to apply pressure in the right places. Vivian will take care of the shop while you're here, he said. She's already spoken to Mrs. Han about the schedule. I didn't ask her to do that, I said. Mom. He said it the way he has said it since he was a teenager, that single syllable that means, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Someone has to manage things. You can't run the shop from a hospital bed." Mrs. Han has been with me for 14 years. She knows the shop better than anyone. Vivian will oversee. Mrs. Han will handle the day-to-day. He patted my hand. "It's just temporary." I looked at the ceiling. There was a water stain in the corner, shaped like nothing in particular. I looked at it for a long time. "Temporary," I said. 3 weeks, maybe 4, then you come home and everything goes back to normal." I did not say what I was thinking. I have found, over many decades, that what you choose not to say in a given moment is often more useful than what you say. I told Thomas I was tired, which was true, and he kissed my forehead and left, and I lay in the blue-white light of the hospital room and listened to the sounds of other people's emergencies moving through the corridor outside my door. The first week, Mrs. Han called me every evening. Brief reports, delivered in her practical way. How many loads processed, whether the afternoon pickup had gone smoothly, a minor issue with the second washing machine that had been making a grinding sound since March. I told her to call Mr. Bin's nephew, who fixed machines cheaply and well. She said she would. The second week, Mrs. Han did not call. I assumed she was busy. I assumed the calls had become less necessary as the routine settled. I lay in my hospital bed and did my breathing exercises and ate the hospital food without complaint, and told myself that 40 years of careful work did not dissolve in 2 weeks. On the 15th day, I called the shop directly. A voice I did not recognize answered. Young, female, professional in the way of someone who has been told to sound professional rather than someone who simply is. "Golden Hands Laundry," she said. "How can I help you?" I paused. "What did you say?" "Golden Hands Laundry. How can I help you?" The shop's name, the name printed on our business license, the name on the sign, Min and I, had chosen together in 1984. The name painted on the wooden board above the door was Tran Family Laundry. "Who is this?" I asked. "This is Lily. I'm the new front desk associate. Can I help you with a pickup or a drop-off?" I asked to speak to Mrs. Han. A pause, some shuffling. Then the young woman came back on the line and told me that Mrs. Han was no longer with the shop. I sat with that for a moment. Through the window of my hospital room, I could see a triangle of sky between 2 buildings, pale and washed out, the color of something that has been left too long in the sun. "When did she leave?" I asked. "I'm not sure exactly. I started last Monday." "Is Vivian Tran available?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Tran is in a meeting with the building manager." "Can I take a message?" "The building manager, Howard Lamb." I thanked the young woman and ended the call. Then I sat very still in my hospital bed and thought about the sequence of events as I understood them. Mrs. Han gone, without a call to me, without any notice that I had received. A new employee who did not know my name. A new name above my door, presumably, since it was appearing in the way the staff answered the phone. And Vivian in a meeting with Howard Lamb? A meeting. Not a maintenance question. Not a routine introduction. A meeting. I called Thomas. He did not answer. I called again. He answered on the 4th attempt with the slightly breathless quality of someone who has been watching the phone ring and debating. "Mom, how are you feeling?" "Thomas, why is the shop being called by a different name?" Silence. The particular silence of someone arranging their words. Vivian thought a rebrand would bring in new customers. It's just a name. The business is the same. Mrs. Han is gone. She and Vivian had some disagreements about how things should be run. It wasn't working out. Mrs. Han has been with me for 14 years. "I know, Mom. But things are changing a little. Just temporarily. Just while you're..." "Thomas." I kept my voice level, even. The voice I use when I need to be heard clearly. "Nothing changes at that shop without my agreement. Nothing. Do you understand me? Mom, you're recovering. You need to focus on. Do you understand me?" A long pause. "I'll talk to Vivian." He did not talk to Vivian, or if he did, it changed nothing, because when I called the shop the following morning, the same young woman answered with the same name, bright and confident, as though it had always been that way. as though Tran family laundry had never existed at all. I lay back against my pillow. I breathed. I thought about the tin box under the altar, undisturbed, waiting with the patience of something that does not need to announce itself to know its own value. Outside, the triangle of sky had gone gray with the beginning of rain. I watched a single bird cross it, moving quickly, already knowing where it was going. Somewhere in my chest, something that had been patient for a long time was beginning, very quietly, to shift. I was discharged on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after they brought me in. The doctor gave me a list of instructions printed on pale yellow paper. Rest, light activity only, no heavy lifting for 6 weeks. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket and thanked him the way you thank someone whose job is now finished. The nurse who wheeled me to the entrance was a young woman named Cam, who had stopped by my room twice during the final week just to sit for a few minutes, not because it was required, but because she had noticed I did not have many visitors. I did not tell her that I had stopped calling Thomas after the 3rd day. There was nothing left to say until I could see things with my own eyes. Thomas was waiting at the entrance with his car running. He got out when he saw me and took my bag and put it in the trunk with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this moment and wants it to be over quickly. He asked how I felt. I said, fine. He said Vivian had prepared the guest room because the stairs to my bedroom might be difficult for the first few days. I told him I would sleep in my own room. He did not argue. That told me something. The house looked the same from the outside. The jackfruit tree in the neighbor's yard had put out new growth since I left, green and thick, reaching over the low wall in the way it always did in March. The front door was freshly painted, which I had not asked anyone to do. Navy blue, where it had always been red. I looked at it for a moment before going inside. Vivian thought it would freshen things up, Thomas said from behind me. I went inside. The altar was the first thing I looked at. It sat in its corner exactly as I had left it. The photograph of Min at 53, the ceramic cup, the dried chrysanthemums gone brown at the edges and needing replacement. The incense holder had a thin skin of ash across the tray. No one had lit incense in 3 weeks. I stood in front of it for a long moment and then I crouched down, slowly, with one hand on the wall for balance, and I looked beneath it. The tin box was there. I did not open it. Not then. I simply confirmed its presence, the way you confirm that a door is still locked without necessarily needing to go through it. Then I stood up and went to the kitchen and asked Thomas if there was tea. There was tea. We sat at the kitchen table, and he told me about the shop in the careful way of someone narrating a version of events they have already edited. New staff. New name. Some new equipment Vivian had ordered. A fresh coat of paint on the interior walls. Business was good, he said. Better than before, actually. Vivian had a talent for these things. I drank my tea and asked questions in a mild, interested tone and watched his face while he answered. Thomas has never been a skilled liar. He learned early that his mother noticed things, and so he learned instead to avoid rather than deceive, to answer the question asked without volunteering anything adjacent to it. I asked about the lease. He said the lease was fine. I asked whether Mr. Tsow's old lease agreement had been extended or renegotiated. He said he believed Vivian had handled all of that with Howard Lamb directly. Did she show you any paperwork? I asked. Mom, the single syllable again. It's a simple question, Thomas. She handled it. It's taken care of. I nodded and finished my tea and told him I was tired and needed to rest. He looked relieved. He left 20 minutes later, saying Vivian would stop by the following afternoon to check on me. I said there was no need. He left anyway. The house was quiet in the way of houses that have been empty for weeks. Not unpleasant, exactly, but with a quality of held breath, as though the walls had been waiting. I moved through the rooms slowly, noting small changes. The photograph on the living room wall had been rehung at a different angle. 2 of the books on the shelf had been moved, their spines now out of the order I maintained. Someone had been in the house, not just Thomas. Someone who moved things without thinking about it, the way you move through a space you consider your own. I was still standing at the bookshelf when I heard the knock at the gate. Mrs. Pauline Wynne stood in the late afternoon light, with a container of soup and the expression of a woman who has been waiting 3 weeks to say something. She is 71 and taught 2nd grade for 4 decades, and has never in my experience been indirect about anything. She came inside and put the soup on the kitchen table and sat down across from me and looked at me steadily. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Tell me what you saw," I said. She had seen a great deal. She had watched, from her window, and from her gate, and from the seat outside Mr. Bin's store where she sat in the mornings, the way you watch things when you have lived in a neighborhood long enough to know what belongs and what does not. She told me about Howard Lamb's visits, 3 of them in the first week after my hospitalization, each one lasting more than an hour. She told me about the morning a truck arrived with new signage, the old wooden board taken down and put into the truck bed without ceremony, gone before noon. She told me about Mrs. Hahn leaving, not gradually but suddenly, on a Friday, with one bag and the tight face of a woman who has been told to go and has decided not to make a scene about it. Then she put her phone on the table between us. "I need you to look at something," she said. Last month, when Vivian was at the shop, she left her phone on the counter while she went to the back. A message came through. I wasn't trying to read it. She paused. But it was open, and the name at the top was Howard Lamb. She had photographed the screen. The image was slightly angled, taken quickly, but the text was legible. I looked at it for a long time. Most of it was what I had expected. Logistics, timing, the language of 2 people coordinating something they did not want witnessed. But there was one line near the top of the visible exchange, time-stamped 6 weeks before my hospitalization, that made the soup on the table in front of me go cold before I had touched it. Howard Lamb had written, "Once the lease comes up, we move. Just need the right moment." And Vivian had written back, "Working on it." 6 weeks before I went to the hospital, I set the phone down carefully. I looked at Min's photograph on the wall from where I sat, the corner of it just visible through the doorway. I looked at it for a long time. "Margaret," Pauline said quietly, "there's something else." I looked at her. "The business license," she said. "I heard Vivian on the phone last week. She was talking to someone at the licensing office. She said the original had been lost, and she needed to know the process for issuing a replacement. The original had not been lost. I knew exactly where it was. But what I did not yet know, what I would not discover until the following morning, when I opened the tin box and spread its contents across my bedroom floor in the gray, early light, was that the document Vivian had been describing was not the only thing she had tried to replace. I opened the tin box at 5:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been awake since 4, lying in my own bed for the first time in 3 weeks, listening to the house settle around me in the darkness. At 5, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat up and lit the incense at Min's altar, watching the thin thread of smoke rise and curl and disappear into the ceiling. I told him I was going to look at the documents now. I told him I needed him to be patient with me if what I found was worse than I expected. Then I crouched down and pulled out the tin box and carried it to the bed. The contents were as I had left them. I removed each item slowly and laid it on the bedspread in order. The original lease agreement, 12 pages, signed by me and by Mr. Sev Tao in the summer of 1984, with the renewal signatures from each 5-year interval since 1989, 1994, 1999, 2004, 2009, 2014. My handwriting on every line, small and precise, the way I was taught to write by a teacher who believed that how you formed your letters said something about how you formed your character. The business license, laminated now, the plastic yellowing at the edges but the text beneath it still perfectly clear. Margaret Tran, owner. The photograph of Min and me on the first day, and beneath all of it, a folded envelope I had not opened in 11 years. It was the letter Mr. Cao had given me when Min died. A personal note, handwritten, 2 pages, in which he told me that he considered our family to be the model tenants of his 40 years as a landlord, and that he intended to honor our lease arrangement for as long as I wished to continue operating the shop, and that if he ever chose to sell the building, he would give me the first opportunity to purchase. He had not been legally obligated to write that letter. He had written it because he was a decent man who understood that some agreements exist outside the language of contracts. I read it again in the gray early light. Then I set it aside and looked at what I had. The lease agreement was intact. The business license was intact. Everything I needed was exactly where I had left it. But Pauline's words were still sitting in the center of my thoughts like a stone in still water, sending rings outward in every direction. Vivian had called the licensing office. She had claimed the original was lost. She had asked about the process for a replacement. I knew what that process looked like. I had navigated it once, years ago, when a flood had damaged some of our early paperwork. A replacement license could be issued if the applicant could demonstrate they were the current operating owner of the business. If someone had changed the name Golden Hands Laundry, the young woman's voice on the phone, bright and certain, and if someone had been running the shop in that name for several weeks, presenting themselves as the current operator, then a licensing official, with no particular reason to investigate further, might issue a replacement without knowing the original still existed. Vivian would not have a replacement yet. The process took time. But she had started it. That was what I had. The start of something that, if I had come home a week later, a month later, might have been finished. I put everything back in the tin box and placed it on the bed beside me. Then I picked up my phone and called David Chu. David had handled the legal paperwork when Min died, and the business transferred cleanly into my name alone. He was thorough and unhurried and charged fairly, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. He answered on the third ring, with the slightly alert quality of a man who has learned over decades that early morning calls from clients are worth taking. I told him what I knew. The name change, Mrs. Hahn's dismissal, Howard Lamb's meetings with Vivian, the text message Pauline had photographed, the call to the licensing office. He was quiet for a moment. The original lease, he said. You have it. I have it. And the business license. The original, not a copy. Yes. Another pause. I could hear him thinking. Margaret, I need you to bring me those documents today. Both of them. Don't make copies at home. Don't photograph them, and send them anywhere. Bring the originals to my office. This afternoon, I said. This morning would be better. I understood what he was not saying. That every day I waited was a day the other side had to move further down the road they were already on. 9 o'clock, I said. I'll be here. I dressed carefully. Dark trousers, a plain blouse, flat shoes that were easy to walk in. I made tea and drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the jackfruit tree in the neighbor's yard move slightly in the early breeze. The street was still quiet. The shop was 4 blocks away, and though I could not see it from here, I knew that somewhere on its front wall was a banner that called it by a name I had not chosen and did not recognize. I picked up the tin box and put it in my market bag, under a folded cloth, the way I used to carry important things to market when Thomas was small and the streets were less predictable than they are now. Old habits, old cautions. David's office was 20 minutes by taxi. He met me at the door and took me to the back room where he kept a proper table rather than a desk. For occasions, when documents needed to be spread out and examined properly, I laid everything out the way I had at home, in order, each item in its place. He read the lease agreement slowly. He examined the business license. He read Mr. Cao's letter twice. When he finished, he sat back and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately name. Not alarm, exactly. Something more specific than that. The lease, he said. Your agreement with Mr. Cao. The renewal clause on page 9. I knew page 9. I had read it many times over the years. The renewal clause specified that the lease would renew automatically every 5 years, unless either party gave written notice of termination no fewer than 90 days before the renewal date. The last renewal was 2019, I said. The next one would be 2 months ago, David said. February. I looked at him. The automatic renewal would have triggered in February, he said carefully. Unless someone gave written notice of termination before November of last year. He paused. Margaret, when Howard Lamb bought the building from Mr. Cao, did anyone send you any documentation? Any letters, any notifications, any communication at all about the change of ownership and its effect on your lease? I thought back. There had been a letter, brief, from a property management company I did not recognize, informing me that the building had been sold and that future rent payments should be directed to a new account. I had updated my payment records accordingly. I had not thought to question what it meant for the lease itself. There was no notice of termination, I said. No, which means under the terms of your original agreement, the lease renewed automatically in February. He set his pen down. The lease Howard Lamb signed with Vivian in March? He stopped. The room was very quiet. David, I said. He looked at me steadily. Margaret. Howard Lamb and your daughter-in-law signed a new commercial lease in March. I've seen a copy. It was filed with the building registry. He paused. But if your original lease renewed automatically in February, then the lease they signed is not the operating agreement for that property. I understood what that meant, but what he said next was something I had not anticipated. Something that rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 3 weeks, about the timeline, about how far back the planning had actually begun. There's something else, he said. The filing. When I looked at the documentation around the new lease, I found a notice of termination. Submitted to the building registry in October of last year. He met my eyes. It was submitted in your name, Margaret. Your signature is on it. I had not signed anything in October of last year. I had not signed anything related to that lease in years. I thanked David and put everything back in the tin box and asked him what he needed from me next. He needed time. A few days to pull the building registry records, to examine the termination notice more closely, to determine what kind of signature had been used and whether there was any paper trail that might reveal how it had been submitted and by whom. He would call me when he had something concrete. In the meantime, he said, I should behave exactly as I had been behaving. Go home, rest. Let Vivian believe that I was a tired old woman recovering from surgery, grateful for the help, unaware of anything unusual. I told him I could do that. He looked at me over his reading glasses. Margaret. I mean it. Nothing confrontational. Nothing that signals you're investigating. The moment they know you know, things become more complicated. I understand. Do you have somewhere to stay other than your house? Somewhere you could keep those documents that isn't your bedroom? I thought about it. Yes, I said. I took a taxi from David's office to the house of my husband's older sister, Aunt Lean, who was 78 and lived alone in a narrow house near the market, and kept everything she considered important in a locked cabinet beside her bed. I had known Leanne for 45 years. She had been at our wedding and at Min's funeral, and at every point between where a family member was required, and she had the quality of old women who have outlasted a great deal of difficulty, a particular stillness, and the patience that comes from having learned the hard way that most crises resolve themselves if you do not make them worse with noise. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people never develop. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and made fresh tea and set it in front of me and said, "The tin box stays here." "That's what I was going to ask," I said. "Don't ask. It's already decided." She sat back down. "What else do you need?" What I needed was information, and the particular kind of information that could not be obtained through official channels, at least not yet. I needed to understand the shape of what Vivian and Howard Lamb had built together, not just the documents which David would investigate, but the human architecture of it. Who else knew? Who had been involved? Whether anyone along the way had felt uneasy enough to remember the details. I knew where to begin. There is a particular advantage to having run a neighborhood business for 40 years. You become, without meaning to, a fixed point in a community. People know your face, your hours, your habits. They know you the way they know the post office or the pharmacy as a reliable presence, a landmark, something that has always been there. When that presence disappears suddenly, people notice, and they talk. And the talk travels in channels that have nothing to do with official records or legal filings. I started with Mr. Bin. I went to his dry goods store the following morning, moving slowly, carrying a cloth bag as though I were simply shopping. I bought dried mushrooms and a bottle of fish sauce I did not need, and stood at the counter in the unhurried way of a woman with nowhere particular to be. Mr. Bin asked about my health. I said I was recovering. He said the neighborhood had not been the same without me, which I knew was partly courtesy and partly true. Then I asked, carefully, whether he had noticed much activity at the shop while I was away. He had noticed a great deal. Howard Lamb had been by nearly every week, always in the afternoon, always with a folder or a briefcase, always going in through the back rather than the front. A woman Mr. Bin did not recognize had come twice with what appeared to be renovation plans, rolled paper under her arm, pointing at the exterior walls. The staff changes had happened quickly, within the first week, all at once. The old employees arriving on a Monday morning and being sent home by noon. Mrs. Han had stood outside for a few minutes afterward, Mr. Bin said, with the expression of a woman deciding whether to make a phone call, and then she had walked away without making one. Did she seem upset? I asked. She seemed, Mr. Bin chose his word carefully, like someone who had been expecting something and found it was worse than she expected. I thanked him and moved on. Pauline was next, which was easier, because Pauline had already decided to help and needed no careful approach. I went to her house in the early evening, and she spread what she had across her kitchen table with the methodical pleasure of a retired teacher organizing a lesson. She had been paying attention since the first week of my hospitalization, she said, because something had felt wrong from the beginning, and she had learned in 40 years of teaching that when something feels wrong, it usually is. She had 4 photographs taken through her window and from the street. Howard Lamb arriving, Howard Lamb leaving, the signage truck, and 1 photograph that made me look twice. Vivian and Howard Lamb standing outside the shop in what appeared to be an argument, faces tight, bodies angled toward each other in the particular way of people who are not in agreement about something they have both already committed to. When was this? I asked. 3 days before you were discharged, Pauline said. I thought that was interesting. I thought so too. If everything had gone according to their plan, there should have been nothing left to argue about, which meant something had not gone according to plan. Something between them had created friction at exactly the moment when they should have been celebrating. I did not know yet what that something was, but I noted it, the way I noted everything, and filed it carefully. My mother used to say that still water runs deepest. She said it about patience, about the particular power of the person who does not reveal what they are carrying until the moment they choose to set it down. I had spent my whole life misunderstanding that saying slightly, thinking it was about concealment, about hiding. But sitting in Pauline's kitchen with 4 photographs spread across the table and the tin box safe at Aunt Leanne's house, I understood it differently. It was not about hiding. It was about depth, about having more beneath the surface than anyone looking at the surface could calculate. Vivian had looked at me and seen a surface, quiet, aging, grateful for assistance. She had not thought to wonder what was underneath. I let her keep not wondering. The following morning, David called. The termination notice, he said, had been submitted by fax from a machine registered to a business address in the city, a small property consulting firm. He had done some checking. The firm had been registered 8 months ago. The registered owner was a woman named Liane Pham, which was a common enough name to mean very little on its own. But the address on the registration, he said, matched the address listed on Howard Lamb's business cards. A firm he owned, registered under another name, used to submit a termination notice on my behalf without my knowledge. That's forgery, I said. It's forgery, David confirmed. And potentially fraud, depending on what they intended to do with the property interests they were trying to establish. He paused. Margaret, there's one more thing. I requested the full registry file for your building. In that file, there's a record of an application made in February just before what would have been your automatic renewal date to register a change of business ownership. The application lists the new owner as Vivian Tran. I sat with that. Was it approved? I asked. It was pending, he said. Still pending, because it required one additional document that hadn't been submitted yet. What document? His answer was quiet and precise and landed in the center of my chest, like something dropped from a height. Your original business license, he said, the one you have in the tin box. They had not been able to finish it because they did not have the original. And they had not been able to get the original because I had come home 3 days earlier than expected. 3 days. That was the distance between everything and nothing. Vivian came to the house on a Saturday morning with a folder and a smile. She arrived at 9 o'clock, which told me she had thought about the timing. Early enough to catch me before I had organized my day, late enough that she could not be accused of being unreasonable. She wore the kind of outfit that is casual on purpose: linen trousers, a pale blouse, flat sandals, the outfit of someone who wants to appear relaxed and has dressed carefully to achieve it. She carried the folder under one arm and a paper bag from the bakery 2 streets over in her other hand. Pastries, an offering, the language of someone who has decided the conversation will go their way and can afford to be generous about it. Thomas was not with her. I noticed that immediately. "I thought we could have breakfast together," she said at the door. "Just the two of us. There are some things I've been wanting to talk to you about." I let her in. I made tea. I put the pastries on a plate without comment and sat down across from her at the kitchen table and waited. She arranged the folder in front of her but did not open it immediately. First, the small talk. How was I feeling? Was the recovery going smoothly? Had I been sleeping well? She asked these questions with the attentiveness of a person who has prepared them in advance, and she listened to my answers with the particular quality of listening that is actually waiting for the small talk to be finished so that the real conversation could begin. I answered pleasantly, mildly, the way a tired old woman answers when she is grateful for the company. "I wanted to explain some things," Vivian said finally, her hand resting on the folder, "about the shop. I know the changes must seem sudden, and I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between us." "Of course," I said. "While you were in the hospital, it became clear that the business needed some restructuring." She said the word restructuring, the way people say it when they mean something simpler that they have decided to make sound professional. The old arrangement was very informal. No real systems, no growth strategy. It worked for what it was, but Thomas and I want to build something more sustainable. "Thomas and I repeated. Mild. Interested. We're planning to expand. A second location, possibly a third within 2 years. Howard has been incredibly helpful in thinking through the property side of things." She opened the folder now and laid a document on the table in front of me, turned to face me so I could read it without reaching. "We've registered the business under a new structure, Golden Hands Laundry, LLC. Thomas and I are the registered directors." I looked at the document. It was a business registration certificate, printed on official paper, bearing a stamp and a date from 6 weeks earlier. The registered directors were listed as Thomas Tran and Vivian Tran. The registered owner was listed as Vivian Tran. "This was registered while I was in the hospital," I said. "We wanted to move quickly. Business opportunities don't wait." She smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that stays in the lower half of the face. "We should have told you sooner. That's on us. But the intention was always to bring you in once you were feeling better, to show you what we've built." "Bring me in," I said. As a founding figure, an advisory role. Your history with the business, your relationships with the long-term customers, that kind of thing is valuable." She pulled another document from the folder. "We've drafted something. An honorary position. It would have your name on the company materials, a small monthly payment, nothing strenuous. Something that honors your contribution without asking you to do heavy work when you should be resting." I looked at the second document. It was 1 page, brief, written in language that sounded respectful and meant nothing. "Honorary founder. Consultative capacity only, non-voting." The monthly payment was a number that would not have covered my electricity bill. She was offering me a title in exchange for the thing she had already taken. "Howard Lamb has been very supportive," Vivian continued, reading my silence as consideration rather than contempt. "He's given us excellent terms on the new lease, 5 years, with options to extend. He's also expressed interest in partnering on the expansion locations, which would give us access to properties we couldn't otherwise afford." She leaned forward slightly. "This is a real opportunity, Margaret, something Thomas has been wanting for years. A real career, a real business. Not just maintaining what already exists. Not just maintaining. Not just 40 years of work and sacrifice and getting up at 5 in the morning and staying until 7 at night, and knowing every customer's name and their children's names and which ones needed an extra week to pay and which ones always paid early. Not just building something from nothing with my husband's help and keeping it alive after he was gone and refusing to let it fail even in the years when it easily could have. Not just that. I looked at the honorary founder document on the table. I looked at the business registration. I looked at Vivian's face, which held the expression of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation and is simply performing the remaining steps. "I'll need to read these carefully," I said. "My eyes get tired quickly since the surgery." "Of course." She began gathering the documents to leave copies with me. "Take all the time you need. but I do want to mention there's a meeting with Howard next Friday. He'd like to begin the formal transition of the original lease into the new LLC structure. Just administrative, really, tying up the last few loose ends. She said it lightly. Loose ends. As though my name on a 40-year lease were a piece of thread trailing from a hemline. It would be helpful to have that settled before we move forward with the expansion plans. She wanted the original lease. She could not complete the transfer without it because David's search of the registry had confirmed that the automatic renewal meant my name was still the operative agreement on the property. She needed me to sign it over. And she needed me to do it without understanding what I was signing. She thought I did not understand. After she left, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the 2 documents she had left on the table: honorary founder, consultative capacity only, non-voting. The paper was good quality, thick and cream-colored, the kind of paper chosen to make things look legitimate. My phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. Hope the visit went well. Vivian really is trying, Mom. I set the phone down without responding. Then I picked up the business registration document and looked at the date again. 6 weeks before my discharge. 6 weeks before the morning in the shop with the red blouse, and the crowd near the door and the words that were meant to finish something. They had been so certain I was already finished that they had begun celebrating before it was over. Outside, a motorbike passed on the street and the sound faded and the house was quiet again. The kitchen smelled like the pastries she had brought, sweet and warm and slightly wrong. The smell of a gesture made by someone who does not know that gifts are not the same as goodwill. I looked at the documents for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called David Chu and told him that Friday was our deadline. David called me on a Tuesday evening, just after 7. I was sitting in front of Min's altar, not praying exactly, but present in the way I am sometimes present there when something is weighing on me and I do not want to be alone with it entirely. The incense had burned down to ash. The room smelled like sandalwood, and the particular stillness of early evening, when the street noise fades and the house holds its breath between the activity of the day and the quiet of the night. I had been looking at Min's photograph. At 53, he had still had the expression of a man who found most things interesting, who had not yet learned to be tired by the world. I envied him that sometimes. My phone rang and I answered it, and David said, "I need you to come in tomorrow morning, early if you can." "What did you find?" A pause. The kind of pause that means what follows will need to be said carefully. "I'd rather show you in person. The documents are better explained face to face." David. Another pause, shorter this time. "The termination notice, the forged one, submitted to the registry. I've had a handwriting specialist look at the signature. It isn't a copy of your signature, Margaret. It isn't someone imitating your handwriting." He stopped. "The specialist says the signature was written by someone who signs their name similarly to you, similar pen pressure, similar letter formation. Someone who has seen your signature many times and writes in a way that is naturally close to it." I did not say anything. "There's more," he said. "I'll show you tomorrow." I sat in front of the altar for a long time after he hung up. The ash from the incense had settled into a thin gray line on the ceramic holder. Outside, a neighbor's radio played something indistinct, voices and music bleeding together through the wall. I looked at Min's photograph and I thought about handwriting, about who in my life had seen my signature many times, who had watched me sign documents and checks and letters across the span of decades, who wrote in a way that was naturally similar to mine because they had grown up watching me write. I thought about Thomas at 6 years old, sitting beside me at the clerk's office, hands folded, very serious. I thought about teaching him to sign his name when he was 7, sitting at this same kitchen table, guiding his small hand across the paper. He had always written like me. His teachers used to comment on it. I went to bed, but I did not sleep. David's office at 8 in the morning had the quality of a room that has been prepared for something difficult. He had the documents laid out before I arrived, arranged in order on the long table, and he stood when I came in and did not offer tea, and did not make small talk, which told me everything about what the next hour would hold. He walked me through it methodically. The handwriting specialist's report, first 4 pages with comparison charts, showing my signature alongside the signature on the termination notice, annotated with observations about pen pressure and letter formation, and the particular way I connect certain letters. The conclusion was measured and precise in the way of expert reports, which meant it said what it meant without saying it directly. The signatures were produced by individuals with closely related writing habits, consistent with a familial relationship or prolonged close association. Familial relationship. I read that phrase twice. There's more, David said. He placed another document on the table, a bank record. The LLC registration for Golden Hands Laundry required an initial capital deposit, standard requirement for business registration. The deposit was made from a joint account. He pointed to the account number, then to the name on the record. The joint account is held by Thomas Tran and Vivian Tran. The deposit was made in January. 2 months before my hospitalization. 3 months before the morning Vivian stood in my shop and told me it did not need me anymore. He knew, I said. The financial record suggests he was involved in the planning from at least January, David said carefully. Whether he understood the full scope of what was being done, the forgery, the registry filing, that I can't tell you. But I could tell it from the pauses in his voice when I called from the hospital. From the way he had answered my questions about the lease with the deliberate narrowness of a man who had been told exactly what to say and nothing more. From the Saturday morning when Vivian came alone, without him, because he could not sit across from me and perform the conversation she had performed. He had not come because he could not look at me. I knew my son. I had known him for 46 years, since the morning he arrived in the world squinting and indignant, and I had watched him become a man who was gentle and weak in equal measure, who loved comfort more than he loved difficulty, who had always chosen the easier thing when the easier thing was available. He had not planned this. That, I believed, but he had known it was being planned, and he had said nothing, and he had signed his name on the LLC registration, and he had made a deposit from their joint account, and he had sat beside my hospital bed and held my hand and told me Vivian would take good care of things. He had held my hand. David placed one more document on the table. He placed it gently, the way you place something down when you know the weight of it. This is the LLC operating agreement, he said. The full version, not the registration summary. I obtained it through the business registry. He opened it to the last page. The signatures. Thomas's signature was at the bottom, above a line that read, I, the undersigned, affirm that I am the lawful co-owner of the registered business, and that all prior claims to the business name, assets, and operational rights have been duly resolved. All prior claims duly resolved. He had signed his name to a statement that said my claim did not exist, that 40 years of my life had been resolved, like a debt paid off, like a problem solved, like something that had been dealt with and could now be set aside. The room was very quiet. I became aware of small things, the kind of things you notice when the larger thing is too large to look at directly. The sound of traffic from the street outside. The slight hum of the fluorescent light above the table. The texture of my own hands resting on the surface in front of me. The calluses and the faint brown spots and the thin rope of a vein along the back of my left hand that had been there since I was 40. These hands had washed and folded and pressed and sorted for 4 decades. These hands had run the machine that kept our family fed. These hands had held Min's hand in the hospital at the end, and arranged his altar afterward, and signed my name on the original lease in the summer of 1984 with a pen I could still remember the weight of, a black ballpoint Min had given me that morning and said to use for important things. Thomas had signed those hands away, not because he hated me, that would have been easier to hold. He had done it because Vivian had made it seem reasonable, had constructed a version of the future in which it was the practical choice, the modern choice, the choice that moved everyone forward, and Thomas had always preferred forward to the uncomfortable work of backward, of sitting with old things, of honoring what had been built before he arrived. I sat at David's table for a long time without speaking. He did not try to fill the silence. He understood that some things need their full space before you can move through them. Finally, I looked up. Is it enough? I asked. What we have. The original lease, the business license, the forged termination notice, the timeline. Is it enough? David looked at me steadily. Yes, he said. It's enough. I nodded. Outside, the morning traffic had thickened. Motorbikes and voices, and the ordinary noise of a city going about its ordinary business, indifferent to the particular weight of what was sitting on a table in a small office on the 3rd floor of a building near the market. I gathered myself the way I have gathered myself at every difficult point in my life, not quickly, not dramatically, but completely. The way you pick up something heavy and adjust your grip and decide you will carry it as far as it needs to go. Then let's talk about Friday, I said. I did not tell Thomas what I knew. That was the hardest part of the days between Tuesday and Friday, not the preparation, not the phone calls, not the careful assembly of documents into the order they would need to be presented. The hardest part was sitting across from my son at dinner on Wednesday evening, and passing him the rice, and asking about his week and listening to him answer in the slightly careful way he had been speaking to me since my discharge, and saying nothing, giving him nothing, letting him believe that the surface he saw was the whole of what existed beneath it. He had made soup. Not well, he has never been a confident cook, and the broth was thin in the way of someone who added too much water and hoped the other ingredients would compensate, but he had made it, and he set the bowl in front of me with the expression of a man doing penance for something he could not name aloud. I ate the soup. I thanked him. He looked at his own bowl and did not quite meet my eyes. Vivian was not there. She had a dinner, Thomas said. A business contact. He said it to the table rather than to me. After dinner, I washed the bowls and told him I was tired and went to my room. I heard him in the living room for a while, the low sound of the television, and then silence, and then the click of the front gate as he left. I waited 20 minutes. Then I sat at my desk with a notepad and a pen and wrote down everything in the order it would need to happen. David had spent 2 days preparing the formal documentation. The original lease, certified copies made and registered so that the originals could be produced without risk of loss. The business license, similarly handled. The handwriting specialist's report. The bank records showing the January deposit. The LLC operating agreement with Thomas's signature. The timestamp records from the building registry showing the sequence of filings. The photograph Pauline had taken of the screen, which David had had examined by a digital records specialist who could confirm it had not been altered. Each item cross-referenced with the next. A chain, David called it. Each link connected to the one before and after, so that removing any single piece would not break the whole. I called Pauline on Wednesday night. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting for the call. I told her what I needed from her on Friday, and she said she would be there. I told her to bring the photograph on her phone, and also a printed copy, which David's office had already prepared from the file she had sent him. She said she understood. She asked if she should bring anyone else. I thought about that. Mrs. Hahn, I said. A pause. Do you think she'll come? I think she saw enough that she will want to. I had called Mrs. Hahn on Tuesday, after leaving David's office. It was the first time we had spoken since my hospitalization, and there was a moment at the beginning of the call where neither of us said anything, the silence of two people who have both been thinking about a conversation and are now uncertain how to begin it. Then Mrs. Hahn said, I should have called you from the hospital, the first week. I'm sorry. What happened? I asked. She told me. Vivian had come to the shop on the 3rd day of my hospitalization and gathered the staff together and explained that the business was undergoing a restructuring and that their employment would be transitioning to a new arrangement. Those who wished to continue under the new management could submit their information to a form Vivian distributed. Those who did not were welcome to seek other positions and would receive 2 weeks additional pay as a goodwill gesture. Mrs. Hahn had asked who had authorized the restructuring. Vivian had said that as co-director of the new business entity, she had full authority. Mrs. Hahn had asked to see the documentation. Vivian had shown her the LLC registration certificate. She had not shown her the lease or the licensing paperwork. She had not mentioned my name except once, briefly, to say that I was resting comfortably and had delegated the transition to the family. She said you had delegated it? I asked. Those were her exact words, Mrs. Hahn said. Delegated the transition to the family. Mrs. Hahn had taken her 2 weeks' pay and gone home, and spent the following days deciding whether to call me. She had been afraid, she said, afraid of causing me more stress while I was recovering, afraid she had misunderstood something, afraid that if she called, and it turned out everything was, as Vivian said, that I had agreed to all of it, she would have made a difficult situation worse for nothing. I told her she had not misunderstood anything. She said, "What do you need from me?" I told her. On Thursday morning I went to Aunt Leanne's house and retrieved the tin box. I sat at her kitchen table and opened it one more time and checked every document against David's certified copies, matching page numbers and signatures and dates. Aunt Leon sat across from me with her tea and did not speak, which was exactly what I needed. When I finished, I put the originals back in the box and snapped the lid closed and held it in my lap for a moment. "Are you frightened?" Aunt Leon asked. "No," I said. And then, "A little." She nodded. "Good. Frightened means you understand what it costs." I understood what it cost. I had understood since Tuesday morning, since the moment I read the phrase "all prior claims duly resolved" and felt the full weight of what my son had put his name on. This was not only about the shop. The shop I could recover. David had made that clear. The legal position was as solid as it was possible to be given what we held. The shop I would get back. What I could not get back was the version of my son I had believed in until Tuesday. The version I had been protecting in my mind for the whole of the previous week. The version that had perhaps been pressured, perhaps been misled, perhaps not fully understood what he was participating in. I had been keeping that version alive through sheer unwillingness to let it go. But his signature on that operating agreement, affirming that all prior claims had been resolved, was not the signature of a man who did not understand. It was the signature of a man who had made a choice and decided he could live with it. I put the tin box in my market bag and thanked Aunt Leanne, and walked to David's office to deposit the originals with him for Friday morning. On Thursday evening, I pressed my clothes for the next day. Dark trousers, the same as before, and my good blouse, the deep blue one I wore on formal occasions, the one Min had always said made me look like someone not to be argued with. I hung them on the hook behind the bedroom door and stepped back and looked at them in the low evening light. Then I lit the incense at the altar and stood in the smoke for a while. I did not speak to Min that night. I simply stood there, the way you stand beside someone you trust when you are about to do something difficult, drawing steadiness from their presence without needing to explain yourself. He had known me for 41 years before he died. He knew what I was capable of. He did not need me to explain. Friday, the incense burned down. I went to bed. In the morning, the tin box would be on David's table. Pauline would have her photographs. Mrs. Hahn would be ready. The lease with my name on it and 40 years of signatures behind it would be certified and documented, and impossible to dismiss. Vivian was expecting a tired old woman to sign something. She was going to meet someone else entirely. I arrived at the shop at 9:45 on Friday morning. The meeting was scheduled for 10. David had suggested arriving early. Not so early that we appeared anxious, but early enough to be present and settled before Howard Lamb and Vivian had arranged themselves the way they intended to be arranged. Positioning matters in these things. David had explained it in his careful way, but I already knew. I had run a counter for 40 years. I understood the difference between the person who is already standing when the other arrives and the person who walks in to find everyone waiting. I wore the blue blouse. My hair was pinned back the way I always wore it, neat, without ornament, the way of a woman who does not need ornament. I carried the market bag with nothing in it. David carried the documents. Pauline was already there when we arrived, standing near the front with her printed photograph folded in her pocket and her hands folded in front of her with the patience of a woman who taught second grade for 40 years and learned to wait. Mrs. Hahn stood beside her. She had dressed carefully too. I noticed her good jacket, her hair combed straight. She looked at me when I came in and gave me a small nod that meant she was ready and also that she was sorry, and I nodded back in a way that accepted both. There were others. Mr. Bin had come. Two of the long-term customers, women who had been bringing their family laundry to Tran Family Laundry since before Thomas was born, stood near the back of the shop with the expression of people who have heard enough to want to see the rest. Word had moved through the neighborhood the way it always moves in places where people have known each other for decades, not loudly, not officially, but thoroughly. The shop itself was unfamiliar to me now, in the way of a room that has been rearranged by someone who does not know why things were placed as they were. The counter was in the same position, but the surface had been cleared of everything. I kept there the small calendar, the cup of pens, the laminated price list I had updated by hand every year. In their place were a branded display stand, and a sign in the new colors, gold and white, Golden Hands Laundry in a font chosen to look modern. The machines were the same. The walls were newly painted. But the smell was different. The particular smell of that shop, the one Min used to call clouds, the one I had breathed every morning for 40 years, that was almost gone. Replaced by something chemical and new and without memory. Howard Lamb arrived at 5 minutes to 10. He was dressed as he always dressed, in the way of a man who wants to be taken seriously by people who take themselves seriously. He saw me and paused for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction I saw the calculation surprise, then reassessment, then a return to confidence, because he had done the math before arriving and the math said that whatever I knew, he was still in the stronger position. He greeted me pleasantly. He asked about my health. I told him I was well. Vivian arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. She came through the back entrance rather than the front, which told me she had not expected the number of people gathered near the door. She wore a different red blouse than the one from the first morning, slightly darker, the red of something more deliberate, and she carried a leather portfolio that contained, I assumed, the documents she intended me to sign. She looked at the room. She looked at Pauline, at Mrs. Hahn, at David standing beside me with his document case. Something moved across her face, brief and quickly controlled. "Margaret," she said, "I didn't realize you were bringing people. I didn't realize you were having a kai trung," I said. And then, because this was not the place for anything but English, a reopening celebration. While I was in the hospital, a small silence. Howard Lamb moved to stand beside Vivian. The two of them together, facing me across the counter of my own shop. I noticed he placed himself slightly in front of her, in the way of a person who believes the territory is theirs to defend. "Margaret," he said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a person who does not understand it yet. "I think there may be some confusion about the current status of the lease arrangement. The business has been restructured under a new—" "David," I said. David set his case on the counter and opened it and took out the first document and placed it on the surface between us. The original lease agreement. 12 pages. My name on every signature line. And Mr. Tsau's beside it. And the notary stamp from 1984 with the date in the corner. "This is the commercial lease agreement for this property," David said. "Signed in 1984, renewed at 5-year intervals, most recently in 2019. Under the terms of this agreement and Oregon, under the terms of Vietnamese commercial tenancy law, the lease renewed automatically in February of this year, as no valid notice of termination was received by either party within the required period." Howard Lamb looked at the document. Something in his face shifted, very slightly. But I was watching for it, and I saw it. "There was a notice of termination filed," he said. "Yes," David said. He placed the second document beside the first, the termination notice from the registry, and beside it the handwriting specialist's report. This notice was filed in October of last year using a forged signature. The signature does not belong to Margaret Tran. We have a specialist report confirming this, and we have records showing the notice was submitted from a fax machine registered to a business entity controlled by you, Mr. Lamb. The room was very quiet. Pauline stepped forward and placed the printed photograph on the counter. The image from her phone, Howard Lamb's message to Vivian, time-stamped 6 weeks before my hospitalization. "Once the lease comes up, we move. Just need the right moment," and Vivian's reply. "Working on it?" Vivian looked at the photograph. She looked at Pauline. She looked back at the photograph. "The lease you signed with Vivian Tran in March," David continued, "was signed on a property that was already under a valid, automatically renewed lease held by Margaret Tran. It does not supersede the original agreement. It is not the operative lease for this property." Howard Lamb said something to David in a low voice about legal interpretation, and he would need to consult his own counsel. David replied that he was welcome to do so, and that the registry filings and the specialist report would be available for review. His voice was very calm, the calm of someone holding a complete hand. I had not spoken since placing the photograph. I looked at Vivian across the counter. She was looking at the documents, and then at the room, and then at Mrs. Hahn, who stood with her hands at her sides and her eyes steady. And I thought about the morning Vivian had stood in this same shop and said, "The shop doesn't need you anymore," said it to Mrs. Pauline and to Howard Lamb and to the new staff and to anyone gathered near the door, said it like a verdict, like a door being closed. She had chosen an audience for that. She had wanted witnesses to the diminishment. I had brought my own witnesses. I reached into my market bag and placed the last item on the counter. The business license. The original, not the replacement Vivian had tried to obtain, not the copy, not the pending application that was still waiting in the registry for a document that had never been lost because it had been under Min's altar the whole time. The original, laminated, slightly yellowed at the edges, my name printed clearly in the center. Margaret Tran, owner. The shop doesn't need you anymore. I looked at Vivian and I thought about what a shop needs. It needs someone who built it from nothing on a summer morning in 1984 with a pen weighted with purpose. It needs someone who stayed through the recessions and the flood and the broken machines and the years of going it alone. It needs someone whose hands know the smell of steam the way some people know the smell of home. It does not need someone who arrived in a red blouse to announce that the work of a lifetime had been resolved. The business license, David said, has never been revoked, transferred, or replaced. Any application for a replacement license based on a claim that the original was lost is therefore fraudulent, as the original exists and remains valid. He paused. Mr. Lamb, I'll be filing the formal legal notice with the registry this afternoon. I'd recommend you speak with your counsel before the end of business today. Howard Lamb picked up his portfolio from the counter. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at me. He walked to the back entrance the way he had come in, and he left without saying anything further, and the sound of the door closing behind him was very clean and very final. Vivian stood alone on the other side of the counter. The leather portfolio was still in her hands. Inside it, I knew, were the documents she had brought for me to sign. The honorary founder agreement, 1 page, consultative capacity only, non-voting. The transfer paperwork, the end of everything, neatly prepared and waiting for my signature. She looked at me. And for the first time since the morning she stood in this shop in her red blouse and told me I was no longer needed, she had nothing prepared to say. I picked up the tin box from David's case and held it in both hands. It was not heavy. It had never been heavy. But I had carried it carefully for 40 years, and I intended to carry it for as long as there was something worth keeping inside. I'll need the keys, I said quietly. All of them. Vivian gave me the keys. Not immediately. There was a moment first, a long suspended moment in which she stood behind the counter with the leather portfolio still in her hands and the room watching her, and nothing moving anywhere, as though the shop itself was waiting to see what she would do. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and placed 2 keys on the counter. Shop key. Back entrance key. She set them down carefully, the way you set something down when you are trying not to appear as though you are setting it down, and she took a step back. She did not leave. I had expected her to leave. I had prepared myself for the version of this, in which Vivian gathered what remained of her composure and walked out through the back entrance the same way Howard Lamb had walked out, efficiently and without looking at anyone. That would have been the intelligent move. That would have been the move of someone who understood that the room had shifted irrevocably and that no further words would improve her position. Instead, she stayed. She stood behind the counter of my shop with her portfolio and her dark red blouse, and she looked at the people gathered near the door, Mr. Bin, the 2 long-term customers, Mrs. Han, Pauline, and something happened to her face. Not shame, not yet. Something that was trying to become anger because anger was more bearable than what was underneath it. This isn't finished, she said. To David, not to me. The legal position is clear, David said. Howard signed a lease with me. That has to mean something. He can't just walk out of here like none of that. The lease he signed is not the operative agreement on this property. He knew that when he signed it, given that his company filed the termination notice in your name. David's voice was even, the even voice of a man who has said difficult things many times and learned that evenness is more effective than force. Mr. Lamb has significant exposure here. I suspect he has already called his attorney. He wouldn't. She said it with a certainty that told me she had not considered this possibility. We had an agreement. You had an agreement based on a forged document and a fraudulent registry filing, David said. When those things come to light legally, agreements tend to dissolve quickly. People with significant legal exposure tend to protect themselves. I watched her understand this. It was not fast. It moved across her face in stages. The way weather moves first, the stillness before the wind, then the darkening that comes after. She had built this entire structure on her confidence in Howard Lamb's participation, and Howard Lamb had walked out the back door without looking at her, and she was only now calculating what that meant for what came next. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen and then looked away from it and did not answer. It rang again. Same number, I assumed. From the way her jaw tightened. You should answer it, I said. She looked at me. If it's Howard Lamb, you should hear what he says now, while there are people present who can witness it. A long moment. Then she answered it, and she did not put it on speaker, but the shop was quiet, and she was standing close, and some of what he said carried into the room. Not words, tone. The tone of a man who has called his attorney and received information that has changed his understanding of his own situation, and is now communicating that changed understanding to someone he is no longer certain was worth the risk. Vivian's face went through several things in the space of 2 minutes. I watched all of them. When she lowered the phone, she was very still. He's withdrawing, she said. To no one in particular, he's withdrawing from the lease agreement. He says his attorney has advised him that the filing irregularities create too much exposure, and he is not willing to, he said. She stopped. He said the property rights were unclear when they should have been clear. I guessed. She looked at me. Yes. And that he relied on your representation that the original lease had been properly terminated. Her mouth opened slightly. He's saying it's my fault. He's protecting himself, I said. That's what people do when they realize the structure they built together was not as solid as they believed. She sat down then. Not in a chair, there was no chair behind the counter. There had never been a chair there. I had run that counter standing for 40 years, but on the low storage shelf built into the cabinetry below the register, sitting on it the way a person sits when their legs have made a decision their mind hasn't caught up with yet. Thomas arrived at 10:47. I knew from the sound of the gate, the particular rhythm of it, the same rhythm it had had since he was a boy, and I always knew from the sound whether it was him or someone else. He came through the front door and stopped when he saw the room. He saw Pauline and Mrs. Han and the customers and David's document case open on the counter, and then he saw Vivian sitting on the storage shelf with her portfolio on her knees, and then he saw me. His face did all the things I had known it would do. Mom. He said it the way he had been saying it his whole life. That single syllable that contained a question he was not sure he wanted answered. Thomas, I said. He looked at the counter. At the documents laid out across its surface. At the original lease with his mother's name running down every signature line for 40 years. At the business license, Margaret Tran, owner, laminated and slightly yellowed and absolutely intact. At the handwriting specialist report sitting beside the forged termination notice, the one bearing a signature that a specialist had confirmed belonged to someone who wrote like a member of my family. He had run his whole life from difficult things, from hard conversations and confrontations, and the particular discomfort of being held accountable for choices made in the direction of ease. He had signed a document that said my claim had been resolved, and he had done it because Vivian had made it seem like the natural next step in a plan that had already been decided, and because not signing would have required him to say something difficult to someone he could not face saying it to. But he was here now. He had come. That told me something. Did you know about the termination notice? I asked. The forged one. A silence that was its own answer. Vivian said it was administrative, he said finally. She said there was a filing that needed to happen to clear the way for the new structure. She said it was standard, and you didn't ask to see it. No. Did you know it would be filed in my name? He looked at the floor. She said she would handle the paperwork. Thomas. He looked up. You signed a document stating that all prior claims to this business had been resolved. You made a deposit in January to register a company built on a foundation that required my signature to be forged and my business license to be taken. I kept my voice level. The level voice of 40 years of mornings, of counting and managing and keeping things running regardless of what the day brought. I am not asking whether you planned it. I am asking whether, at any point, you chose not to know. The room waited. Thomas looked at his wife on the storage shelf. She was looking at her portfolio, at the documents inside it that had been meant to end this conversation before it began. She did not look back at him. Yes, he said. I chose not to know. I had not expected him to say it clearly. I had prepared myself for deflection, for partial acknowledgement, for the architecture of excuse that people construct when they want to admit something without fully admitting it. His directness landed in the center of my chest and sat there, heavy and also, unexpectedly, something close to relief. He was still the person I had raised. Somewhere in there, underneath the choices he had made toward comfort and away from difficulty, was the boy who had sat beside me at the clerk's office with his hands folded and watched me sign my name. "I'll need you to come to David's office," I said. "There are documents that will need to be corrected. The LLC registration, the operating agreement. Your name will need to be removed from any claim on this business." "I know," he said. "And there will be a legal process regarding the forged filings. David will explain what that involves." He nodded. Vivian stood up from the storage shelf. She had been very quiet for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the quality it always carried, that particular brightness of someone performing confidence. What was left underneath was smaller and more ordinary. "The shop doesn't need you anymore," she had said. That first morning in the red blouse, she had said it to dismiss me, to reduce me to something that could be set aside, something past its usefulness, something that could be replaced by a banner and a new name and younger hands. She looked at the counter now, at everything laid across it, at the keys she had placed there, at the 40 years of signatures, at the room full of people who had known me before she arrived and would know me long after she was gone. "I'll need somewhere to stay," she said to Thomas. Not to me. She was done, I think, trying to say anything to me. "That's between the two of you," I said. I picked up the keys from the counter, both of them. I held them in my palm for a moment, feeling their weight, which was not much, which had never been much, 2 small pieces of cut metal that opened 2 doors in a building where I had spent 40 years of mornings. The shop smelled different now than it had when I arrived. Or perhaps I was only noticing it differently, now that the room had exhaled. Underneath the chemical newness of the fresh paint, underneath the artificial brightness of the gold and white signage, there was still something older, something that had soaked into the walls over 4 decades of steam and work and early mornings and the particular discipline of showing up. It smelled, just faintly, like clouds. I changed the sign back on a Saturday morning. Mr. Bin's nephew came with his ladder and his tools and took down the gold and white banner in less than 20 minutes, rolling it up without ceremony and carrying it to his truck. Underneath, the brackets where the old sign had hung were still there, still solid, which I had expected. The bones of things built to last tend to outlast what is placed over them. The new sign was not the old sign. The old sign was gone, taken away in a truck bed on a day I had not witnessed, and I did not try to recreate it exactly. What I had made instead was simpler painted wood, dark letters, the name in the same style but with a steadier hand than the one I'd had in 1984, because 40 additional years of practice will do that. Tran Family Laundry. The same name that had been on the business license in the tin box for 40 years. The same name that had never legally changed, regardless of what a banner had said for 6 weeks. Mrs. Hahn came back on Monday. I did not ask her to come back. I called her on Saturday evening, after the sign was up, and I told her that the shop would be open again on Monday morning, and that I would be there, and she said she would be there too, and we did not discuss terms or arrangements or any of the formal language that belongs to new beginnings. We had not needed that language in 14 years, and we did not need it now. The customers came back too. Not all at once. The first week was quiet in the way of things that are rebuilding, but steadily. Mrs. Fuang on Tuesday with her husband's work shirts. The family from the corner house on Wednesday with their weekly bundle. Old Mr. Dad on Thursday with his one good suit that he brought in every month and collected with the same dignified formality he had used for 20 years. Each of them found their own way to say what they wanted to say, which was not much and was everything. A nod. A longer than necessary exchange of pleasantries. The particular kindness of people who have decided to act as though nothing interrupted the ordinary, because the ordinary is what they came to restore. I did not feel triumphant in those first days. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was tired, in the good way that comes after work that has asked everything of you and received it. I felt the specific satisfaction of a thing resolved, not perfectly, not without damage, but truthfully. The shop was mine again. The name above the door was correct. The documents in the tin box were where they belonged. David had filed the legal corrections with the registry, and the fraudulent termination notice had been formally nullified, and the LLC registration was in the process of being dissolved. Howard Lamb's attorney had contacted David with a settlement proposal that David described as generous and motivated by fear, which I accepted without pleasure and without hesitation because it was not generosity I was after. Thomas came to see me on the second Thursday. He came to the shop, not the house, which I thought about afterward. He could have come to the house, where we would have been private, where no one would have witnessed whatever happened between us. He came to the shop, to the counter, and he stood on the customer side of it the way customers stand, with his hands at his sides and nothing in them. I was sorting a bundle of linens when he arrived. I finished the sorting before I looked up. Not to make him wait in a punishing way, simply because the linens needed sorting, and I had learned a long time ago not to let the arrival of difficulty interrupt the work that anchors you. "I've been to see David," he said. "I signed everything." "I know," he told me. "I want to." He stopped. Started again. "There isn't a way to explain it that makes it better. I know that." "No," I agreed. I told myself it was for the business. For the family. That eventually you would see it was the right thing. He looked at the counter, at the surface where the documents had been spread on Friday morning. I don't know when I stopped being able to hear how that sounded. I set down the last of the linens. I looked at my son across the counter of the shop where he had sat as a 6-year-old boy with his hands folded, watching me sign my name to a future I was building for both of us. "Vivian is going to her sister's," he said. "In the south. He paused. "It's over. That part." I did not say I was sorry to hear it, because I was not sorry in a simple way, and Thomas deserved honesty more than he deserved comfort right now. What I felt about Vivian was not hatred, which surprised me slightly. What I felt was the particular absence of feeling that comes when someone removes themselves from the category of people you carry. She had tried to take everything I had built and she had failed, and now she was going to her sister's, and that was the shape of what remained. "Are you going to be all right?" I asked Thomas. He looked up. He had not expected me to ask that. "I think so," he said. "Eventually. Come to dinner on Sunday," I said. "I'll make the soup properly this time." He almost smiled, not quite. But almost. After he left, I stood behind the counter for a while in the afternoon quiet. Mrs. Hahn was in the back managing the machines. Through the front window I could see the street. Mr. Bin's store, the jackfruit tree visible above the rooftine of the neighbor's house 2 streets over. The light was the particular gold of late afternoon, the kind that makes ordinary things look considered, like everything has been placed where it is on purpose. I thought about what I was leaving behind, and what I was leaving it to. Not Thomas. Not yet. He had work to do first. The quiet, interior work of a person who has looked honestly at a choice they made and decided to become someone who would not make it again. That work could not be rushed and could not be done for him. But he was capable of it. I had always known he was capable of it. Gentle people often are, when they finally decide that gentleness toward others must include gentleness toward the truth. The shop would be here. The license was in the tin box, and the tin box was back under Min's altar where it had always been. And the lease with my name on every renewal line was certified and registered and as solid as anything I had ever built. When the time came to pass it on, it would be passed clearly, completely, without confusion about who it belonged to and what it had cost to keep it. That was what I had wanted. Not revenge, not victory in the way the word is usually meant. Only clarity, only the restoration of something true. I reached under the counter and found the cup of pens I had brought back from home. The same cup that had sat there for 20 years before it was cleared away. I set it in its place. I straightened the laminated price list. I moved the small calendar to the corner of the counter where it had always lived, where I could glance at it without reaching. The shop smelled right again. Or perhaps I had simply remembered how to smell it not as something lost and recovered, but as something continuous. Something that had been here the whole time, steady beneath everything that had been placed over it. My mother used to tap my hand and say it when I was 12 years old, and furious about something I can no longer remember. She said it when I was 26, and afraid the business would fail in the second year. She said it at Min's funeral, standing beside me in the heat. Not as comfort exactly, but as reminder. Still water runs deepest, Margaret. I had spent 60 years learning what she meant. The surface that shows you nothing is not empty. It is not passive. It is not waiting to be filled by whoever arrives with the loudest claim. It is full, entirely full, of everything that has been carried through every difficult year without announcement. Full of early mornings and late closings and machines that broke and were fixed and broke again. Full of a husband's voice saying it smelled like clouds. Full of a son at 6 years old with his hands folded, watching his mother sign her name. The water does not need to move to be deep. It only needs to know what it is holding. If anyone has ever looked at you and seen only what you can no longer do, only the years on your face, only the slowness in your step, only what they think you have already given, this story is for you. The things you have built with your hands and your years and your quiet endurance do not disappear because someone stops noticing them. Still water runs deepest, and the people who underestimate you have simply forgotten to look beneath the surface. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to make sure these stories find the people who need them most. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to protect something you built from the people you trusted most, and what gave you the strength to do it?